Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. There's Stu's Game Reviews video. I have a really exciting video today, which is an interview with Stephane Racle, who is a really amazing collector of PC games, and I have known him, at least been acquainted with Stephane for a very long time. I think this is the first time we've actually done a video chat together, so this will be exciting. And Stephane recently was in the news around a really crazy thing that's been going on in terms of alleged counterfeiting and forgery of PC games. It's been a lot of the news outlets, and so I thought it'd be really interesting to do a video. We do a little interview. First of all, we can just talk to Stephane a little bit, learn a little bit more about who he is, then we can talk about some of what's been going on. But first of all, welcome, Stephane. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Stu. It's a pleasure to be on your channel. I think you're absolutely right. It is the first time that we actually do this sort of one-on-one. But funny enough, I was checking my my emails just before getting here, and I think I have an email from you from 2004. So it's been 17, 18 years since we've been sort of communicating around each other, or at least. So yeah, it's kind of fun to be I guess call it face to face for the first time.
That's probably just as far as Google, goes back. It's probably been longer than that.
Exactly. Yeah, it was the first. It was actually when I got my Gmail account. So
exactly. So obviously we've both been doing this for some time. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? How long have you been collecting, and what else should people know about you?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, so I've been. My focus specifically is on the Apple II, although I do like the sort of general, gaming, vintage computer, vintage gaming type community significantly. The Apple II is a computer that I grew up with. I particularly liked adventure games, and specifically Infocom games back in the early days of Text Adventures. And of course, back then, most of the games that I had were not originals. But I remember getting the first original, and one of the only originals that I had was a copy of Suspended by Infocom. Nice. And it was that really funky packaging with the mask, the big mask packaging.
Sure.
And I thought it was so cool, like the box and the mask and the map that came with it, and the instruction booklet, and everything else was done so well, right? So over the years, I kind of was interested in collecting Infocom games in particular, because they had all this really interesting packaging, and then I just became interested in the Apple II world as a whole. Mostly, I mean, I have a few games for other computers, such as the IBM Windows, a few games on the Mac, a few games on other platforms, but I'm really focused on the Apple II. The second piece is that my interest is collecting for sure, but part of my interest is also preservation, archiving, and history.
Sure.
So I've been, and specifically again looking at the Apple II, the last 5 or 6 years, I would say, have been a fantastic time for preservation and archiving on the Apple II, with the advent of the AppleSoft floppy disk controller, which is a device that a very, very smart individual called John Morris built. And it's not just the hardware, it's the software that comes with it to analyze what is captured, but essentially it allows you to capture a floppy disk at the flux level, which is nothing new. But on the Apple II, the software actually allows you to make a perfect image, essentially, if I can put it that way, of an Apple II disk, copy protection and all. And then what's happened is that Apple II emulators have supported this new format that's called the WAS format that's been created, and now you can capture that perfect image without, with the copy protection, and you can actually run it in an emulator with the copy protection and everything. So it's been fantastic. I've imaged something along, around 3,000 disk sides in the last few years. Others have done the same, and we've found what's been pretty amazing is that we've found a bunch of software that either was not even known before, or software that was known before but for which no original copy or original image existed. All that existed is a kind of a cracked copy, right? So it's been great. It's been great that way. But I've been interested in this sort of this history part of things since the early 2000s. I'm going to say done a couple of minor attempts at putting some stuff out on the web. Ran out of time in some cases. I've never sort of taken it too far, but there's some stuff out there, and like scans of packaging and so forth. A little bit of historical information too. I've particularly enjoyed in a few cases being able to get in touch with with authors and just getting their story. Sometimes it's a very short story, but it's still an interesting story of how the games came together and that kind of thing.
That's pretty awesome. I actually bought an applesauce recently, and the first disc I tried to do was Championship Load Runner, and it worked, but I couldn't get to run an emulator, so I was like talking to John Morris. He's like, "You picked the hardest game to start, like the hardest kind protection." I did just randomly, that's what I picked up, but I didn't know that. But I mean, PC gaming is so broad that like, even if you wanted to like buy everything or focus on everything, you really couldn't. I mean, you have to have some kind of niche. I mean, you Apple II and adventure games is your niche, basically. Mine always was IBM adventure games. That was mine. And I love like Infocom and the graphic adventures. I never was so into Apple II back in the day because when I was a kid, we never had an Apple II. We went from a TRS-80 straight to like an Atari and a Commodore and then an IBM. So I never owned an Apple machine. It's like embarrassing now, but but no, it's you have to sort of specialize, right? You can't. The market is huge for games. It's crazy.
The collecting world is really interesting. I was commenting on that actually not very recently about how for the most part, like everybody's got their own little reasons for collecting, and then their how can I call it? The scope of their collecting, right? So, some people collect more because they like to have the physical items. Some people collect more because, truly it's about preservation and archiving. Some people are somewhere in the middle. And of course, there's some people that see collecting as a bit of an investment and things like that, right? And that's all fair. And then, like you said, some people are really platform specific, Apple II or PC or Commodore 64, that kind of a thing. Some people are genre specific, adventure games and role playing games, or action games, or so forth, right? It just makes it interesting. But for the most part, what I find is the people are interesting people, right? So it tends to be kind of fun to do this type of a thing and exchanging information and exchanging stories and that sort of a thing, which is we talked about a little bit, and I know we're going to talk about it in more detail about that whole scamming counterfeit scandal here. But one of the main reasons to me as to why that's really disappointing is, other than the fact that some people are losing or have lost potentially some significant sums of money, is that it really puts it really impacts that whole relationship between people in the community, right? And that's really not great.
And to your point, people do this for different reasons, and I think you and I both do this for the love of the game. And when you see something like that happen, like there was something else involved other than the love of the game. There's love is something else.
No doubt about it. Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Well, so just to go back to some other stuff you've done, and you mentioned websites. So over the years, like I found myself not being able to keep myself restricted to IBM, and especially the Apple II has so many great adventure games and graphic adventures. So I started getting some of those. Unfortunately, I wish I bought them back in 2004 when we first, started talking, because they were much easier to find then, even the ones you could find, and they were much cheaper. Now, forget it. Some of these are like, whatever. But you have this website, the Gallery of Unexplored Entities, GUE, which I guess is a play on Great Underground Empire, right? from Infocom. Inside joke for Infocom fans. But like that one lists some of the really obscure games, like the ones that you never see on eBay. Even if you look your whole life, you may never see a copy. What made you put that up there? What made you start doing that?
Yeah, good question. So absolutely, I'm glad you caught the little play there on GUE. I put that website up, I think it was around 2006 or so. And really my intent, I go back to my comments on preservation and archiving and distribution and making this available so people can actually see these kinds of things, right? and it was shortly after I was lucky enough to essentially acquire the collections of two. They weren't really collectors; they were just gamers from back in the early 1980s, and they were, they had significant amounts of games, and some of those games were pretty rare games. At least at that time, I had never seen copies of them, or some of them I'd never even heard of before.
Give me an example, so we just to excite people who are listening.
Yeah. So there's a game. So there's an adventure game called the Lost Ark of the Covenant, which is an Apple II text and graphic adventure games. It was sold through a company called Microscan. And it was funny enough. I got a story on that one because it was the person who wrote the game and sold it. His name is John Bodie, and he was the CEO of Black Ops Entertainment for a while. I'm not sure what he's doing nowadays. It's been a long time, but he only sold. He's the one who put that package, those game packages together. Bought some Ziploc bags, made some photo, did the drawings. Photocopied some cardboard paper, put that packaged it up, put an ad in a magazine, and sold it exclusively through an ad in a magazine, and ended up selling like a couple hundred copies. Right, so that's one example. A couple of other examples. Phoenix Software. I was lucky enough again to actually meet the former owner of Phoenix Software, who started the company. Phoenix Software made their sort of claim to fame is actually a utility called Zoom Graphics on the Apple II, which allowed you to do essentially screen captures and print those on printers, which was really actually useful in the early 1980s. But the gaming side, they sold two adventure games called Masquerade and Sherwood Forest, which are pretty interesting adventures, like sort of well done, a little bit of cheeky, good sense of humor. Really difficult ones, especially for Masquerade. But then they also sold a couple of arcade games, and those arcade games, action games, never really. I think Ron, the former owner of Phoenix, told me they sold like something like 200 copies.
Wow.
So like one of them's called Mad Rat. Another one called Bats in the Belfry, one called Gemini. They're pretty unknown games, right? So I wanted to do two things. I wanted to be able to put scans of the packaging out there so people could actually see it, and I wanted to put images of the disc so that they would be preserved.
Sure.
And I sort of did that, but I had my technical knowledge on creating disc images. It's not, even today, it's not fantastic, but it's certainly much better than it was back then. But back then, we didn't actually have the tools necessary to do this.
Right.
So I link that to my story about the Apple stuff. Nowadays, we can do this. Back then, we couldn't really do that, and the images that are captured are not really that great. There's all kinds of issues with them, and they're not true images of. Or true representations of what was on the original disc. So those are a couple of examples of some of the games that I have on that website.
It's super cool. I mean, Sherwood Forest, I don't have a copy of that, and I've seen it a couple times go for like way more money than I'm I wouldn't say able, but more money than I'm willing to pay. and Masquerade, I only have a copy because you sold me a copy of the American Eagle re-release of it. You sold me a couple of games a couple of years ago. And I know you had a bunch of other games that you had that were doubles, but you said, I'm not selling those at all. I'm waiting for trades because, and I don't really, listen, I feel bad, but I don't blame you because these games are so hard to find. Like, it's like if you don't, if you don't trade with somebody, you may never get a copy of it. And I was thinking to myself, he's never going to find anybody to trade with him because his want list is so short. Who's going to have those games? But somehow, maybe it's just a good segue into, what's going on lately. Somehow you found a trade for some of these. And you thought you did.
I certainly thought I did, and this trade is centered around a game called the Chambers of Zenobia. Again, sort of little known adventure game, released in 1981 by a company called Avant-Garde Creations. They were based in Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, in the western United States. This game is mostly text with a few graphics. In fact, it's even got a few sound effects, which is kind of weird. But adventure game, and I learned about this game in, I think, 2003 or so, so what, 19, 20 years ago. And I was always interested in finding a copy. Now, this game is not, it's not what I would call a lost game, because there's always been a classic cracked version out there that you can download on Apple II sites, etc. I think probably, I'm guessing 1 week, if even that, after the game was released in 1981, somebody cracked the game and started distributing it, and that's what was available. But to my knowledge, and it certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but to my knowledge, I'd never seen an original copy of this game, and I was always very interested in being able to get one so that I could. So I could scan the packaging, and then do make an image of the disc itself. So we had an original, copy of Chambers of Zenobia for preservation and archiving. I learned about a year ago that an original copy seemed to have surfaced. So I was very interested. Unfortunately, I was a little bit too late to the game on buying it or trading for it. But I had a contact that knew who had bought it. And what I told them is, if you can, work out a trade, or I'm willing to buy it, but I'd be willing to work out a trade. Maybe I have something that's really interesting that person who bought it, whom I didn't know who it was at the time, does not have. I have some pretty, like you said, interesting stuff, and then maybe I can get Chambers of Zenobia, and I'll make it worthwhile. Like, I'll make it a really good trade. I'm really interested in getting that. So person that I was talking to said, okay, well, I'll see if I can work something out. And then a few months later, I heard back, and they said, he'd be willing to trade for Chambers of Zenobia. Let's see if we can work out a trade. So over a few months, we worked out a trade, and it was a four-game trade. I sent 4 games, and they were sending me back 4 games.
So which 4 games did you send, and which games did you get back?
Okay, so I sent Wizard and the Princess by Online Systems.
Now, that by itself, it's like, oh my god, like a first printing of Wizard and the Princess,
yeah.
I think I've seen that for auction once or twice, maybe. I certainly don't have a copy. I mean, the thing is, I was an IBM collector. I have a bunch of adventures in Serenia, for all the good it does me.
Yeah,
but
which is pretty rare too.
It's rare, but not anywhere near as rare as the first printing of Wizard and the Princess. So, props to that one. Okay, keep going.
So, first printing of Wizard and the Princess, a folder of the first release of Soft Porn by Blue Sky Software.
That's the one that what's his name? Chuck Benton gave to a whole bunch of different people. He told me he'd give me one. He never sent it to me. So
he sent a few out, and then I think he kind of disappeared. So he kind of got tired of sending a few out. I ended up getting 2 from him. So
nice.
So that's why I was like, okay, well, I haven't one, then I'm certainly willing to trade it. And then the 2 other games that I sent were Cannonball Blitz and Pegasus 2 by Online Systems. So not super rare stuff,
but it's been hard to find.
Still stuff that's pretty interesting. But certainly from my trade, that Wizard and the Princess first edition and that Soft Porn folder were pretty, the pretty rare things.
Sure.
Right? The games that I was supposed to get were Chambers of Zenobia. The second game was Fracas by Quality Software. It's an early.
You pronounce it Fracas. That's interesting. I thought it was called Fracas. I think it depends on the pronunciation, right?
Probably because I'm French, and I pronounce it the way that it might be Fracas. I'm not sure. The third game was Santa Paravia and Fiumaccio, which is a game released by Instant Software back in probably 1978 or 1979. So a very, very early game. That came on tape, actually. And then another game called Enchanted Island by Mad Hatter Software, which also came on tape. It's an a very early adventure game.
And Fracas is the first RPG by Stuart Smith, right? Is that from remember correctly?
Absolutely.
And the Enchanted Island is by is it Greg Hassett, right?
Greg Hassett.
Who was 14 years old. There were 10 text adventures, and he disappeared off the face of the earth, and nobody knows what happened to this guy, apparently. And I'd love to get my hands on all of his games, pretty much, for the TRS-80. That's what I would collect. But anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. It's exactly. You're absolutely right. And funny enough, Chambers Chambers of Zenobia was written by a 14-year-old. He was in high school at the time, called Stephen Sachs,
Nice.
and he decided that he had an Apple II. He was playing games, and then he decided, he said, instead of, games are expensive, especially when you're 14 years old. So he said, instead of buying games, I think I can make my own that are just as good as the ones that I'm buying. So he decided to write Chambers of Zenobia, and he sent it out because there was a couple of companies at the time that were looking for games, saying, "Hey, send us your games and we'll publish them for you." And Avant-Garde Creations, they managed to make a deal, and he sold it through them. And then and he ended up selling another game called Race for Midnight, which is actually a little bit more well known, which sold somewhere around, he remembers somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 copies. Also an adventure game, which is a bit of a follow-up to Chambers of Zenobia, but that's it. So that was what the trade was and what I was supposed to get. The trade went through finally, and I guess maybe there was some red flags there, but it took a while for the trade to go through.
It takes time to... No, I'm not going to make a joke. Go ahead.
And we ended up sending our stuff to each other in just a few weeks back, last month actually, about a month ago, 13th of May or 14th of May, something along those lines, right? About a month ago. I got my package in the mail a few days after, which was fantastic, and I was really excited. I opened it up, and there's those 4 games in it, including Chambers of Zenobia. I'm super excited. First thing I did, I imaged the floppy disk for Chambers of Zenobia using the applesauce, and it returned all green, which means from a data integrity perspective, everything's fully readable, everything checks out good. I'm like, oh, I'm super excited. This is awesome. We finally have an original copy of Chambers of Zenobia. And what I didn't do at the time is actually check what that data was, which I definitely should have done. But I was in a bit of a time crunch.
Sure.
All I wanted to do was to make sure I had the disk imaged. And what I normally do when I get these sort of rarities or things that are unarchived, unpreserved, is I'll send a disk image to someone called 4AM.
I know of 4AM. I don't know who it is. Like, it's a secret mystery man. But I guess it's a good way of contacting this person through the bat phone or something like that.
Yeah. So 4AM is an Apple II archivist, and he's the guy that will take the image file and then will convert it to a usable, convert it to a usable image that can be used in an emulator. He'll do a little bit of analysis on it, and he'll normally post it to the Internet Archive, so then it's available for everybody to use. So, for the last couple of years, we've sort of had this informal kind of workflow here, where if I get something interesting, I'll image it, I'll send it to him, he'll do his work, his magic, and then he'll put it on the Internet Archive, and then It's available for everyone. So it benefits everybody. So I did that. I sent it to him, and a couple of days later, he comes back to me and he sends me a message and he says, "Bad news. At Chambers of Zenobia," and he sends me a picture, and it's a picture of the cracked screen from the the version that's been floating around on the internet for years, and it says, presented by the data killer. And then I'm like, what the hell? Like, this is supposed to be an original disc, and here there's a cracked version on it. So something's not right. And I had also imaged Fracas, and he says, and Fracas is not original either. And I'm like, oh, what? And he sends me again a picture, and it says Pronto DOS on the directory listing. And Pronto DOS is a disk operating system that was released by Beagle Bros back in 1982. Fracas was released by Quality Software in 1980. And Fracas is rare, but it's not that rare that there's no copies out there. There's a few people that have copies, and in fact, there is a known a disk image out there, and it's known to be an Apple DOS 3.2 disk. So again, I checked on the internet, and that release of Fracas is the one that's available on download sites, and that's been available on download sites for quite a while. So now we have 2 discs.
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. So I once bought on eBay for like $100 what purported to be an original Mystery House disc, like not the gold label one, but the really first one that came with the first packaging, just a disc, and it was like in a lot or something. And then when I got it home and read it, I saw that it was like the version they released in 1987 into public domain. So it definitely was not an original disc. And I sent it back and got my money back, but I checked it out. But like the person that sold this to you or traded this to you, like how could they think they can get away with putting a cracked, like they might as well put nothing on the disc at all. Like why put a cracked version? Like do you think the guy think you're dumb or something? Like you wouldn't see it was cracked? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like
I can't speak to it.
Right, obviously, I'm just speculation here.
What was going on in their mind? Although I suspect that if you look at what's happened in the past, and there was of course as I think a lot of people know, there's another group of collectors that was also investigating Enrico Ricciardi for potential counterfeit items, and a number of people from that group had never, they had floppy disks, but they never actually read the floppy disks, right?
Right.
So again, it's a bit of a different purpose to the collecting, and even some people, I think, don't even have the hardware to read them. So perhaps he thought that I would not be really that interested in what was on the disc, and I wouldn't look at it in much detail. And it turns out that I specifically, the main reason for doing this was because I wanted to read what was on the disc.
You got the wrong person, basically.
Yeah, and I guess I should add to that point. He did not know.
Oh, right.
The trade was kind of anonymous because it was through an intermediary. I did not know who I was trading with.
Right.
He did not know who he was trading with until this all sort of came undone. So, maybe he just assumed that it wouldn't matter, and that's it, right?
Yeah, which brings up interesting things. So you never really dealt with him directly, the person that's alleged to have done this stuff. So it's even like there's another layer of obfuscation there that makes it even harder to sort of track down. By the way, you mentioned other investigations. I heard about what was going on with you before I heard what was going on with them, but my impression of those guys, like you said, is that a bunch of people had been getting like these games from the same source without knowing that they were all getting it, because I was told keep it quiet and everything else. And it seems like it's been going on for a fairly long time. And I think what their report said, it was going on for several years or whatnot. And just nobody ever bothered to really closely inspect what they received because they assumed that the source was sort of above reproach. And even if they would have found some inaccuracy, they would have figured it's due to them being ignorant. Because most of these guys actually, I know, or I don't know them, but I'm acquainted with most of these people, and most of these people have not been collecting anywhere near as long as you and I have been collecting. Like, they've been collecting maybe for 5 years, maybe 10 years at the most, and for them, these are their holy grails that they're getting from the owner of the master of the holy grails, let's just say, and they would never have thought to inspect it. You, on the other hand, were in a position where, you bought it to sort of dump it and to preserve it, and and all that. And plus, you're like one of the people who knows these games more than anybody else in the probably the person who knows these games more than anybody else in the world. And therefore, like, it sort of went right to the wrong person to be able to figure out what's going on here. It sounds like.
Well, for sure. So it's interesting what you mentioned, because there's a couple of things here that play against, let's say, play against us as collectors. When you get this kind of stuff. I mean, the first thing is, like you said, reputation of the seller, right? Somebody who has a reputation and is thought to be above reproach, you don't tend to necessarily question what you get, right? Or if you see something and it looks a little bit weird, you're like, well, maybe that's just how it is, right? And you don't go too far. The second piece is thinking about the work that's required to do a good fake, right? And it's one thing to copy like a manual or a sheet, but it's something else to create a bot, right? So you get something and you're like, okay, well, maybe this doesn't look quite fully right, or there's something, it's a bit weird maybe, but you're like, okay, well, maybe that's the way it is. And you think to yourself, you get in mindset saying, hey, you know what, like, it would be it would require a significant amount of work to actually create a forgery of this. So it probably is not happening, right? So that, I think, is the sort of the second thing that plays against you. And I'll fully admit, the thing that clued me in to this was the content of the disc from my trade. There's a couple of things that I saw physically on the package, and I was like, I had a couple of doubts, but I was not, it wasn't enough. And I might, if it hadn't been for the content of the disc, I could have been fooled. And in fact, the fourth game that I received, Enchanted Island, for a while I was thinking, even after I knew that the three other games were fake, I thought maybe this one's real, because it looks kind of real. I wasn't 100% convinced, but I'm like, this one is probably real. And turns out it wasn't after really inspecting it in detail, right? So it's sort of easy to convince yourself of it. And the third thing is not having something to compare it to, right? So some of those games are pretty rare, and if you get one in hand, you probably don't have another, right? So it's hard to compare it to. Yes, sometimes there's pictures that are available, but you compare it to the picture, and different different lighting, quality of the picture, different age of the packaging or condition of the packaging, that kind of a thing. Sometimes it can be difficult to be able to tell that. So I think that plays against us in really determining whether something is a forgery. But by and large, if you assume that the seller is sending you authentic stuff, you'll probably convince yourself that it is authentic, right? It's not hard to do. I don't know if you want to do a bit of a show and tell here, but
yeah, sure.
Like this is, so I talked about boxes, right? I mean, this is a box for Santa Paravia.